Wednesday, the mayor of Tel Aviv confirmed 1,000 buildings are now uninhabitable. Not damaged, not threatened, uninhabitable. That is the official count as of Tuesday. This follows Iran's saturation bombardment of the Iron Dome grid. The defensive system that was supposed to protect the capital reached its breaking point. The buildings are gone. I've been through the municipal damage assessment. Here is what it actually shows. If you have been following this conflict daily, you have been watching headlines about missile exchanges and ceasefire negotiations. What you have not been watching is the arithmetic of defense saturation. The numbers coming out of Tel Aviv right now are not about one attack. They document the moment when a defensive architecture built over 2 decades reached capacity and failed. Millions are not reacting to future threat assessments. They are reacting to physical infrastructure destruction in the largest city in the country. What most coverage is treating as an escalation event is actually a threshold crossing. The defensive posture Israel has relied on since Iron Dome became operational no longer functions the way strategic planning assumed it would. What is at stake is not whether the next attack happens. What is at stake is whether the defensive response to that attack accelerates or prevents the collapse of the system itself. The scale of what just happened in Tel Aviv answers that question. If you want to understand not just the building count, but the mechanism that produced it, and what it means for every decision Israel makes in the next 72 hours, subscribe to Geopolitical Analysis right now and turn on notifications. We are going through this completely. Let us start with Mayor Ron Huldai's official statement, because it is the foundation of everything that follows. On Tuesday, April 22nd, Huldai told the Municipal Emergency Committee that 1,046 buildings in Tel Aviv are now classified as uninhabitable due to structural damage from the sustained bombardment over the previous 96 hours. That is the direct quote from the transcript now circulating among Israeli disaster response agencies. The language matters. Not at risk, not damaged and under assessment. Uninhabitable. The word choice tells you the engineering assessments are complete and the conclusion is final. These structures cannot be occupied. The significance is that Tel Aviv has never absorbed this level of infrastructure loss in a single event window since the state was founded. The second piece, Colonel Douglas Macgregor testified before a closed-door Senate Armed Services briefing, and the transcript was leaked to 3 separate defense outlets within 18 hours. Macgregor stated that the U.S. Navy is effectively paralyzed by what he called a death zone blockade in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has deployed a combination of anti-ship missiles, drone swarms, and fast attack craft in overlapping fields of fire that make carrier strike group operations inside the strait a non-viable option under current rules of engagement. What this confirms is that the U.S. cannot provide the naval reinforcement or logistics corridor that Israeli strategic planning assumed would be available in a sustained conflict scenario. The scale of the problem is the third piece, and it closes the argument. The Islamabad Protocol ceasefire, signed 6 days ago on Thursday, April 17th, included specific language guaranteeing the protection of major population centers from large-scale bombardment, page 4 of the agreement. That language was negotiated by Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey as the external guarantors. Tel Aviv is the largest population center in Israel. 1,046 buildings are now uninhabitable. The protocol did not protect the capital. Cross-referenced against the ceasefire terms and the actual municipal damage count, the conclusion is that the Islamabad Protocol has failed to deliver its core security guarantee within 1 week of signature. But the building count is not the story. The interception failure rate is the story. What coverage is missing completely is that the 1,046 uninhabitable buildings are not the result of 1,046 missile impacts. They are the result of approximately 190 to 240 impacts based on blast radius analysis from structural engineers now on site in Tel Aviv. The rest of the incoming bombardment was intercepted. Iron Dome functioned. It knocked down the majority of the incoming threats, and the city still lost over 1,000 buildings. The framework tool is this. When a defense system reaches saturation capacity, every interception becomes a resource depletion event that accelerates the next failure. Here is what that looks like in the current situation. Iron Dome interceptors cost approximately $40,000 per unit. Iran's Shahed 136 drones cost roughly $20,000 per unit. The cost-exchange ratio is already unfavorable, but that is not the operational problem. The operational problem is inventory depth. Israel maintains an estimated stockpile of 1,500 to 2,000 ready interceptors at any given time, including resupply from U.S. pre-positioned stocks. Iran launched an estimated 800 to 1,000 projectiles, drones and missiles combined, over the 96-hour bombardment window that preceded the Tel Aviv damage count. Even at a 90% interception rate, Israel expended 700 to 900 interceptors. The stockpile is now at 50% or below. That is the current math. Here is the same framework in a related recent event. On Sunday, April 20th, 2 days before the Tel Aviv damage assessment, the Iron Dome battery protecting Haifa went fully defensive for 6 consecutive hours. No offensive counter-battery fire. No drone intercepts outside a 5-kilometer radius. The system went into pure survival mode because the interceptor magazine was critically low and resupply had not yet arrived from southern depots. Haifa is the third largest city in Israel and its primary northern port. The defensive grid protecting that city functioned exactly as designed and still reached a point where it could not sustain operations. The mechanism is identical: high interception rate, finite inventory, saturation bombardment. What to watch for using this framework? If Iran launches another mass bombardment in the next 48 to 72 hours, watch whether Israeli defensive doctrine shifts from interception dominant to evasion dominant. If civilian evacuation orders start coming out of Tel Aviv, Haifa, or Beersheba before the next bombardment wave, that tells you Israeli defense planners no longer trust the Iron Dome grid to protect static populations. If those evacuation orders do not come, it tells you either the interceptor resupply arrived in sufficient quantity, or Israeli leadership has decided that large-scale civilian evacuation creates a panic signal worse than the bombardment itself. The mechanism exists because Iron Dome was designed to defend against sporadic rocket fire from non-state actors with limited inventory and no industrial production capacity. Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad could launch dozens of rockets in a single day. Iron Dome could intercept 90%, and the threat would be neutralized. Iran is a state actor with industrial missile and drone production at scale. The defensive system is facing a threat profile it was never architected to handle. The doctrine assumed the attacker would run out of projectiles before the defender ran out of interceptors. That assumption no longer holds. The mechanism explains the current posture. What it means for the decisions Israeli leadership makes in the next 72 hours is the harder question. If this analysis is giving you what the daily coverage is missing, subscribe to Geopolitical Analysis right now. Share this with someone who is trying to understand what is actually happening. We are not done. The closest historical parallel is not the 2006 Lebanon War or the 2014 Gaza escalation. It is the Cuban Missile Crisis naval blockade in October 1962. The comparison most analysts are reaching for is the wrong one. The Second Lebanon War involved Hezbollah rocket bombardment and Iron Dome precursor systems, but Hezbollah never reached the inventory scale or the sustained bombardment tempo that Iran is demonstrating now. The actual parallel is the moment during the Cuban Missile Crisis when Soviet submarines operating in the Caribbean reached a depth and proximity advantage that neutralized U.S. naval superiority in the blockade zone. On October 27, 1962, Soviet submarine B-59 was operating at crush depth to avoid U.S. destroyers. The submarine carried nuclear-tipped torpedoes. The captain and political officer both authorized use. The decision to fire required 3 officers. The third officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. The torpedo was not launched. The U.S. destroyers never knew how close they came. The pattern that matters is not the nuclear question. The pattern is that proximity and persistence neutralized technological and numerical advantage. The U.S. had more ships, better sonar, air superiority, and total surface control. The Soviet submarines still reached a firing position. That is, the mechanism completing its cycle in 1962. The parallel is not that Israel faces a nuclear threat from Iranian forces in immediate proximity. The parallel is that Iran has achieved a bombardment capacity and geographic positioning that neutralizes the technological superiority of Iron Dome. The system still works. The interception rate is still high, and the city is still losing 1,000 buildings. What is the same? The defender has better technology. What is different? The attacker has sufficient scale and industrial production to render the technological gap irrelevant. What is different now versus 1962 is that the Cuban Missile Crisis lasted 13 days and ended with a negotiated resolution before any defensive system reached depletion. The current conflict is now in its 3rd week of sustained operations, and the Islamabad Protocol ceasefire, signed 6 days ago, has already failed to stop the saturation attacks. The variable that has changed is time. The 1962 crisis resolved before inventory depth became the determining factor. The 2026 crisis is now testing whether Israel's defensive stockpile can outlast Iran's offensive production rate. Let us step back from the specific building count in Tel Aviv and look at what this means for the larger trajectory. Here is what happens if Israel, under pressure from Saudi and Turkish mediators, accepts a renegotiated Islamabad Protocol that includes external security guarantors with enforcement authority on Israeli territory. In the next 48 hours, you will see U.S. diplomatic pressure for Israeli acceptance synchronized with Saudi public statements offering Red Sea naval corridor protection in exchange for ceasefire compliance. The pressure will be explicit. The message will be that Iron Dome cannot sustain another 96-hour bombardment cycle, and that the only path to interceptor resupply at scale is a ceasefire long enough to allow U.S. transport flights to deliver the stockpile. Israeli leadership will face a choice between tactical degradation and strategic compromise. The tactical degradation is another bombardment with a 50% depleted interceptor stockpile. The strategic compromise is accepting third-party security guarantors on sovereign territory for the first time in the state's history. In the next 2 to 4 weeks, what the public sees is a ceasefire holding with visible Saudi and Turkish observer deployments in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. What is happening in back channels is that Israel is negotiating the scope of external guarantor authority, whether they have veto power over Israeli counterstrikes, whether they control airspace access, whether they can enforce no-fly zones over Israeli cities without Israeli approval. The image is stabilization. The reality is that Israel is trading operational autonomy for interceptor resupply and temporary threat reduction. In the next 6 to 12 months, the long-term consequence of this path is that Israel becomes dependent on external actors for core defensive functions. The Iron Dome stockpile is maintained by U.S. supply commitments that now come with explicit conditions on use. Saudi Arabia and Turkey gained veto authority over Israeli military operations that risk escalation. Iran achieves its strategic objective without taking additional territory. Israel's defensive independence is gone. Who benefits? Regional mediators gain influence. U.S. maintains alliance structure without direct military commitment. Iran demonstrates that saturation warfare works. Who is damaged? Israeli strategic autonomy. What was permanently changed? The assumption that Israel can defend its population centers without external permissions. What reverts? Nothing. Once external guarantors are embedded in Israeli security architecture, removal requires a crisis that justifies their expulsion. That crisis will be worse than this one. A ceasefire purchased with sovereignty does not expire when the ink dries. Here is what happens if Israel rejects external guarantors and chooses to sustain defensive operations independently while conducting offensive counterstrikes against Iranian production facilities. In the next 48 hours, you will see Israeli airstrikes targeting Iranian drone and missile production plants inside Iran. The strikes will be deep penetration missions using F-35s. The targets will be the facilities producing Shahed 136 drones and Fateh 110 tactical ballistic missiles. The strikes will be successful in the immediate tactical sense. Buildings will be destroyed, production will be disrupted, and Iran will respond by activating Hezbollah's northern front at full scale. Hezbollah has an estimated stockpile of 150,000 rockets and missiles positioned in southern Lebanon. If even 10% of that stockpile is launched in a coordinated bombardment, Iron Dome will be facing 15,000 incoming threats. The system cannot intercept 15,000 targets. The math does not work. In the next 2 to 4 weeks, northern Israel becomes uninhabitable. Not threatened, uninhabitable. Haifa, Tiberias, Safed, Kiryat Shmona. Every city within 60 kilometers of the Lebanese border will be under sustained bombardment that the Iron Dome cannot stop. The public sees mass evacuation south. The back-channel reality is that Israeli defense planners are making triage decisions about which cities to defend and which cities to evacuate because the interceptor stockpile cannot cover the entire northern grid. The U.S. begins emergency resupply flights, but production capacity cannot match consumption rate. Israel is burning through interceptors faster than Raytheon can build them. In the next 6 to 12 months, Israel faces a two-front saturation war it cannot win defensively. The only path to ending the bombardment is ground operations into southern Lebanon to destroy Hezbollah launch sites and ground operations into western Iran to destroy production facilities. Both operations require mobilization at a scale Israel has not attempted since 1973. Both operations occur while the homeland is under sustained bombardment. The strategic landscape looks like this. Israel is fighting a multi-theater war. The U.S. Navy cannot project power into the Strait of Hormuz, and regional actors are not mediating. They are choosing sides. Saudi Arabia does not defend the U.S. logistics corridor because there is no ceasefire to guarantee. Turkey closes Incirlik Air Base to U.S. resupply flights. The war expands beyond Israel's capacity to contain it. What was permanently changed? The assumption that Israel can absorb sustained bombardment and maintain societal cohesion. What reverts? Nothing. Once a major population center is evacuated under fire, the psychological threshold is crossed. Israeli offensive capability breaks Iranian production over time, but defensive failure creates internal collapse. We are tracking every dimension of this here on Geopolitical Analysis. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. The mainstream tells you what happened today. We tell you what it means for tomorrow. The statement that captures this entire situation is not about the buildings or the interceptors. It is about the consequence structure that Israel is now operating inside. Every defensive move now carries a catastrophic penalty Israel cannot afford. That is the frame that explains the Tel Aviv damage count, the Islamabad Protocol failure, and the choice Israeli leadership is facing in the next 72 hours. Why this is the right frame for this story? Because it explains why a 90% interception rate still produces 1,000 uninhabitable buildings. The penalty for interception is stockpile depletion. The penalty for not intercepting is direct impact. Both choices accelerate the collapse. The traditional calculus assumed that effective defense prevented escalation. That calculus is now inverted. Effective defense depletes the system. The penalty is no longer conditional on failure. The penalty is built into success. The question that all of this leads to, and that the next 72 hours will force an answer to, is whether the U.S. will position a carrier strike group inside the Strait of Hormuz or maintain standoff distance outside Iranian anti-ship missile range. In the next 48 hours, watch whether the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower carrier strike group, currently operating in the Gulf of Oman, moves north through the Strait of Hormuz into the Persian Gulf, or remains in its current holding position approximately 200 kilometers southeast of the strait. If it moves north into the Gulf, that tells you the U.S. has assessed that the Iranian anti-ship threat is manageable and that visible naval presence is necessary to deter further escalation. It also tells you the U.S. is willing to risk a carrier in confined waters to maintain the logistics corridor for Israeli resupply. If it does not move, if the strike group remains at standoff distance, that tells you Colonel Macgregor's assessment is shared by operational commanders. It tells you the Navy has concluded that the risk of a carrier loss in the strait exceeds the strategic value of forward presence. Watch the position. Both outcomes tell you what the U.S. is actually willing to commit. Over the next week, watch whether U.S. Air Force C-17 transport flights into Tel Aviv increase in frequency and what their cargo manifests contain. If flights increase and manifests show Iron Dome interceptor canisters, that tells you the U.S. is prioritizing stockpile replenishment and believes a ceasefire window exists to rebuild inventory. The flight rate will tell you whether resupply is matching consumption. If interceptor deliveries are arriving every 18 to 24 hours, consumption is outpacing production, and the stockpile is still depleting. If flights decrease or manifest shift to humanitarian supplies and evacuation support equipment, that tells you the U.S. has assessed that the defensive grid cannot be sustained and that the priority has shifted from defending in place to managing population relocation. The cargo tells you what the strategy is. Over the next month, watch whether the Islamabad Protocol renegotiation talks include language requiring Israeli acceptance of external security guarantors with enforcement authority on Israeli territory. If that language appears in draft agreements leaked to regional media, that tells you Saudi Arabia and Turkey are making guarantor presence a non-negotiable condition of ceasefire extension. It tells you the mediators have concluded that Israeli independent operations are the escalation risk, and that the only path to de-escalation is external constraint. If that language does not appear, if renegotiation focuses only on bombardment limitations and timeline extensions, that tells you Israel has successfully resisted the guarantor framework and is maintaining operational autonomy at the cost of continued vulnerability. The presence or absence of guarantor language in those drafts is the signal that closes the larger question of whether Israel's defensive independence survives this conflict. When the U.S. carrier positioning becomes public in the next 48 hours, the analysis will be here. When that carrier positioning becomes public in the next 48 hours, the analysis will be here. Not a summary, not a headline repeat. Evidence, assessment, what it means for the trajectory, in that order. Subscribe to Geopolitical Analysis and turn on notifications. What this channel provides that news does not is the framework that makes the next development legible before the mainstream catches up. The news will tell you the carrier moved or did not move. We will tell you what the move means for interceptor resupply timelines, Iranian escalation decisions, and whether the two scenarios split is resolved or deepened. What makes this story worth tracking to its conclusion is that the outcome determines whether defensive saturation warfare becomes the new operational standard for regional conflict. If Iran demonstrates that industrial-scale drone and missile production can overwhelm a first-tier defensive system, every state actor with a drone program and a regional adversary will draw the same conclusion. The framework scales. The next video in this story will cover the Iron Dome interceptor resupply flight analysis and what the tonnage per day numbers tell you about whether Israel can sustain the current defensive posture through the end of April. Evidence first, analysis second. What it means for you, always. We will see you in the next. This is Geopolitical Analysis.